During World War II, African American soldiers in the United States faced both discrimination and segregation within the military and society. Despite these challenges, they made significant contributions to the war effort and played a crucial role in the eventual desegregation of the U.S. military and the quotidian lives of the common African American at large. Welcome to the second episode of the experiences of Black soldiers during the Second World War. We are taking you on a journey through the untold stories of heroism, sacrifice, and triumph that unfolded on the front lines and beyond, as we illuminate a crucial chapter in the tapestry of wartime history. Do not forget to support our efforts by pressing the like button in front of you. Share with family and friends, and subscribe if you are yet to. Your support means the world to us. Waco native Doris Miller, an African American, was one of the first American heroes of World War II and a civil rights icon whose heroism at Pearl Harbor helped desegregate the U.S. military, all before his tragic death at age 24. Historians talk about the long civil rights movement, stretching all the way back to the colonial era. Military actions have long played a role in that. African American men participated in military action with white Americans in the American Revolution and subsequent wars. They did these things with a purpose, like Doris Miller, to show their patriotism and prove not only their fighting ability as worthy of respect, but to show their citizenship and prove their merit as full citizens of the United States, willing to fight and die. World War II brought permanent results, and Miller was a catalyst. These moments were integral in pushing forward the civil rights movement to the crescendo that we now recognize and emphasize from the 1960s. Miller never got the chance to see how the movement played out. He was killed in action at the age of 24 in the Battle of Malkin in 1943. But appreciation for his outsized impact in American life continues to grow. When Dr. T. Michael Parrish, the Lyndon G. Bowers Professor of American History at Baylor, began researching Miller's story, he knew he was going to be telling the story of an American hero. A Doris Miller Memorial was dedicated in Waco in 2018, just across the Brazos River from Baylor's Clifton Robinson Tower. And Parrish's book, Doris Miller, Pearl Harbor, and the Birth of the Civil Rights Movement, is the first scholarly biography to study his achievements. In 2020, the U.S. Navy announced that a supercarrier would be named for Miller, the first supercarrier named for an enlisted sailor or for a Black American. Doris Miller's heroic actions at Pearl Harbor and his quiet but persuasive voice as an advocate for positive change constituted a vital contribution toward the full and equal acceptance of Black men and women in the U.S. Navy and the nation that it serves. While surrounded by prevalent segregation and the hostility that follows, African American soldiers regularly reported their mistreatment to the Black press and to NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, pleading for the right to fight on the front lines alongside white soldiers. The Black press was quite successful in terms of advocating for Black soldiers in World War II, says Matthew Delmont, a history professor at Dartmouth College and author of Black Quotidian, Everyday History in African American Newspapers. They point out the hypocrisy of fighting a war that was theoretically about democracy, at the same time having a racially segregated army. In 1942, the Black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, in response to a letter to the editor by James G. Thompson, a 26-year-old Black soldier, in which he wrote, amongst other touching remarks, "Should I sacrifice my life to live half American?" launched the Double V campaign. The slogan, which stood for a victory for democracy overseas and a victory against racism in America, was touted by Black journalists and activists to rally support for equality for African Americans. The campaign highlighted the contributions the soldiers made in the war effort and exposed the discrimination that black soldiers endured while fighting for liberties that African Americans themselves didn't have. Without these crucial roles that black soldiers were playing, the American military wouldn't have been the same fighting force it was, says Delmont. That was a perspective you didn't see much in the white press. To further prove what this means, we are going to be discussing briefly on more black experiences in this episode, shedding light on the valiant dedication of African Americans during the Second World War as we proceed. As casualties mounted among white soldiers toward the final year of the war, the military had to utilize African Americans as infantrymen, officers, tankers, and pilots, in addition to remaining invaluable in supply divisions. From August 1944 to November 1944, the Red Ball Express, a unit of mostly black drivers, delivered gasoline, ammunition, food, mechanical parts, and medical supplies to General George Patton's Third Army in France, driving up to 400 miles on narrow roads in the dead of night without headlights to avoid detection by the Germans. The 761 Tank Battalion became the first black division to see ground combat in Europe, joining Patton's Third Army in France in November 1944. The men helped liberate 30 towns under Nazi control and spent 183 days in combat, including in the Battle of the Bulge. The Tuskegee Airmen, the all-black fighter pilot group trained at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, escorted bombers over Italy and Sicily, flying 1,600 combat missions and destroying 237 German aircraft on ground and 37 in air. In our previous episode, we quite discussed the great exploits of the Tuskegee Airmen in the Second World War. This time, let us look at some other intense occasion where African American soldiers defied profoundly the biases held against them. In particular, we shall be discussing the heroic exploits of the 761st Tank Battalion. The 761st Tank Battalion. This pretty much happened like it happens in swashbuckling movies. Only this time, the bloodiness was no graphics, but a crying, thought-provoking, sickening reality. It was a live war, one which people dutifully embraced to live for something. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion could only be deserving of a grander entrance. Long before the superhero Black Panther made his debut on the silver screen in the year 2014, alongside the first Avenger, there was, once upon a time, the very original Black Panthers who were unleashed in the European theater of World War II some time ago in 1944. The African-American 761st Tank Battalion, better known as the Black Panthers, arrived in Normandy, France in October 1944 and entered combat shortly after their landing. They would endure a record of 183 straight days in combat and would eventually liberate 30 towns on their crusade into Germany. Before they became the first African-American tankers in the U.S. Army to see combat, though, their quest had begun back home in the Deep South, where some of their first battles were, with white comrades and civilians who were reluctant to accept them as equals. The 761st Commanding Officer, Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, was well aware of the prevalent racist attitudes towards black soldiers, and so he pushed the battalion to achieve excellence. The 761st was formed in the spring of March 15, 1942 in Louisiana and activated April 1, 1942 at Camp Claiborne. According to Army historical records, the battalion was comprised of 30 black officers, 6 white officers, and 676 enlisted men. One of those 36 officers was baseball star Jackie Robinson, who never saw the European theater due to his refusal to give up his seat on a military bus and subsequent court battle. The battalion was eventually moved to Camp Hood, Texas, where they would train for over 2 years. The men trained in M4 Sherman medium tanks and the M5 Stuart light tank. although their extended training was more so the result of Army commanders not willing to give African Americans the chance to prove their worth in combat. The extra training would prove invaluable when they engaged German armor in combat. Once on the battlefields of Europe, the 761st set out to prove they were just as good, if not better, than their white comrades. Upon arriving in Normandy, France, in late 1944, the 761st was assigned to General George S. Patton's Third Army. Patton was well known for his colorful personality, and upon meeting the troops, would wind up welcoming the 761st into his Third Army, motivating them with a rousing speech right before they set out to engage German forces. Thus, he said, "Men, you are the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down." Those gruff yet encouraging words from Third Army Commander Lieutenant General George Patton in October of 1944 to an all-black tank battalion helped spur them toward their role in the defeat of Nazi Germany in the Second World War. The 761st Tank Battalion was one of the most effective tank units to participate in hostilities during World War II. Author and former NBA legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has this to say about them. Their entry into the European theater was marked by one crucial success after another. Certainly, they were General Patton's most effective unit, he said, because they were a replacement unit. They were shifted around to different areas quite often. In every instance, their presence meant that competent tank support had arrived. The commander of the 17th Airborne, General John Miley, felt that he was able to send many more of his soldiers home alive as a direct result of the effective support of the 761st Battalion. Abdul-Jabbar was inspired to learn about the 761st after watching a documentary in 1992 about a World War II black tank unit. He also became interested in the struggle of black veterans to gain the recognition they deserved. His own father, F.L. Al Alcindor, was trained as an artilleryman at Fort Bragg, NC, but served his country stateside. The general belief at the time was that African Americans would not be effective in combat arms units and held mostly support roles. However, Major General J. Leslie McNair, Chief of the Army's Ground Forces, felt that black fighting men would be just as valuable as white fighting men in defeating the Axis powers. Thus, he pushed to have them serve in combat units. The Army documented that the battalion entered France with greater confidence than most Negro units could muster upon entry into a theater of operations. Confident in its abilities, the 761st joined the 26th Division of the 9th Corps of the Third Army. Division Commander Major General Willard S. Paul had welcomed the battalion on the 31st of October, the aforementioned year of their landing. "I am damned glad to have you with us," he said briskly. "We have been expecting you for a long time, and I am sure you are going to give a good account of yourselves. I've got a big hill up there that I want you to take, and I believe that you are going to do a great job of it." After another successful battle, word spread about the 761st, and just 2 days later, Patton visited the battalion and further challenged the 761st soldiers with his short speech. Abdul-Jabbar, who authored the book Brothers in Arms, the epic story of the 761st Tank Battalion, World War II's Forgotten Heroes, sheds light on the unit's history, personal stories, and accomplishments. As they lumbered towards the French town of Morville-le-Vicq, their dark tanks stood out like sore thumbs against the background of freshly fallen snow. To the waiting, battle-hardened Germans, these Americans, freshly arrived in France, untested in combat, might have seemed like lambs to the slaughter. But they were dead wrong. they never would have expected what was coming. As a matter of fact, the courage and professionalism of the first African-American armored unit to enter combat paved the way for the ending of racial segregation in the U.S. military. The legacy of their exploits had been nothing short of profound and amazing, so that it had to be turned into a film produced by Black Panther star Michael B. Jordan. In his Sherman tank, B Company Commander Captain John D. Long, a young black man from Detroit, Michigan, knew what he was fighting for. "Not for God and country," he said later, "but for me and my people. I expected to get killed, but I swore to myself there would never be a headline saying my men and I chickened." Now, though, he and his men were about to discover what it was like to face the fanaticism of the Second World War German Army and to come up against elements from 2 SS Panzer divisions. Captain John D. Long told the authors of the book, The Invisible Soldier, Morville-les-Vic was supposed to be a snap, but it was an inferno. When B Company forced its way into the town on the morning of 9 November 1944, it met a hail of machine gun and anti-tank fire coming from the windows and cellars of the houses, from all directions. At a crucial intersection, the tank commanded by Sergeant Roy King took a direct hit from a Panzerfaust. King was shot dead as he exited the blazing tank, and 2 other crew members were wounded. The situation was now desperate. Without the tank's firepower, the supporting infantry were being pinned down and picked off by the Germans. Some 15 American soldiers were now lying dead or wounded in the street. But the 2 tank crew members who had escaped uninjured were, like their company commander, in no mood to chicken out. Private John McNeil grabbed his submachine gun and used it to keep the Germans at bay, while technician James T. Whitby re-entered the burning tank via the escape hatch. He started firing the .30 caliber machine gun. McNeil kept firing from under the Sherman. The tank was hit 2 more times. McNeil and Whitby stayed where they were. They kept firing for 3 hours, taking out enemy machine gun nests and a Panzerfaust team that was trying to fire from an upstairs window. And so the advance continued, and when, after another day's vicious fighting, the battle was over, a captured German remembered the men who had kept firing from the burning tank. "Such bravery," he said, "I have seen but once before, and that was on the Russian front." 1 officer and 9 enlisted men of the Black Panthers lay dead. Another 20 men of the 761st were wounded. "We got our lumps," recalled Long, "but we took that town." Before becoming one of the first 2 black first lieutenants in the U.S. Tank Corps, Long had been a cook at Fort Knox, Kentucky, because the pre-war U.S. Army thought the Negro was only good for menial labor. Now Long was on his way to earning the nickname the Black Patton, and the men of the 761st were proving that in modern mechanized warfare, the Negro was every bit the equal of the white man. However, their achievements did not stop at Morville-les-Vic. By the end of the war in Europe, the Black Panthers had fought their way further east than nearly every other American unit. They fought in France and Belgium and were one of the first American battalions to meet the Russian army in Austria. They had played a key role in the Battle of the Bulge and in the crossing of the Rhine. They had inflicted more than 130,000 casualties on the enemy, received 391 decorations for heroism, and liberated Gunskirchen, a sub-camp of Mauthausen concentration camp. And yet, when Staff Sergeant Johnny Stevens got his honorable discharge from the Army and tried to board the bus from Fort Benning, Georgia, on his way home to New Jersey, the driver refused to let him on and called him boy as he did so. Stevens was at least lucky that he was waiting to board the bus with members of the 26th Infantry Division, which had provided the foot soldiers in the battle for Morville-les-Vic. An enraged white sergeant swiftly ensured Stevens was on the bus and riding up front. But the disappointment must have been crushing. This wasn't the first incident involving a white bus driver and a Black Panther. In July 1944, Jackie Robinson, later to become the first black man to play Major League Baseball, had been a popular first lieutenant. But while on leave from training at Camp Hood, Texas, he had refused to move to the back of a bus when told to do so by a white civilian driver. After the military police were called, Robinson ended up facing court-martial charges that included public drunkenness, even though he didn't drink. Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, the white commanding officer of the 761st, refused to authorize the proceedings, so top brass transferred Robinson to another unit, whose commanding officer would consent to a court-martial. Robinson was acquitted, but he missed his chance to serve in Europe with the Black Panthers. In the years that followed, especially as they watched the civil rights struggle of the 1960s generation, the men of the 761st could have been forgiven for wondering exactly what had changed. The fighting professionalism of these men, who deployed to France with just 6 white officers and who got their first black commanding officer in 1945, did help give President Harry Truman the justification he needed to end segregation in the U.S. military in 1948. But for the 761st itself, no presidential unit citation was forthcoming until 1978, when, 33 years after the war ended, President Jimmy Carter belatedly recognized the Black Panthers' contribution to winning it. Between late 1944 and May 1945, the Black Panthers, with the motto, "Come out fighting," were engaged in 183 days of continual combat. During the Battle of the Bulge, as the Nazis tried their last desperate offensive on the Western Front, the 761st was thrown against the crack troops of the 13th SS Panzer Division. 5 days of bitter fighting in freezing cold were summed up by the message of Staff Sergeant Frank Cochran, who radioed from inside a tank facing withering German fire. "They've hit me 3 times, said Cochran, "but I'm still giving 'em hell." On the 9th of January 1945, it was the SS who retreated from the Black Panthers, abandoning the road that had been the main supply route for the German forces besieging the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. In March 1945, they played a key role in punching a hole in the Siegfried Line and getting the Allies across the Rhine. Operating well beyond the range of friendly artillery support, they attacked the enemy where his defenses were strongest, facing elements of 14 German divisions and inflicting 4,100 casualties. The accomplishments of the 761st, said Carter's presidential citation, were truly magnificent, as the successful crossing of the Rhine River into Germany was totally dependent upon the accomplishment of their mission. 2 months later, the Black Panthers liberated the skeletal inmates of Gunskirchen and watched them throw themselves on the raw meat of a horse that had just been killed by shell fire. After that, Long recalled, Jerry was no longer an impersonal foe. By the time they linked up with the Soviet troops of the 1st Ukrainian Army on the banks of the N River in Steyr, Austria, they had fought through 6 European countries, displaying, in the words of the presidential citation, indomitable fighting spirit and devotion to duty. But it wasn't just the presidential citation that was late in coming. For some individual soldiers of the 761st, proper recognition had to wait until the Clinton presidency, not the Carter era. That was more than 50 years after Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers performed his heroics in France. As a company advanced on 16th of November 1944, Rivers's tank was hit by a mine. Shrapnel had cut his leg from knee to thigh and as deep as the bone. Captain David J. Williams, his company commander, told him, "Reuben, you've got $1 million wound. You're going home." "Captain," Rivers replied, "you're going to need me." Williams would later recall giving his sergeant a direct order to return to the rear. Pushing away the morphine needle, Refusing the stretcher, Rivers told his commanding officer, "This is the one order, the only order I'll ever disobey." Rivers, who had already won the battalion's first Silver Star in the advance towards Morville-le-Vicq, got into another tank and carried on. By 19th November, the wound had become infected and he was in great pain. Again, he refused to leave the field. As A Company advanced on the town of Bourg-Altroff, Rivers's tank was towards the front. Suddenly they came under murderous fire from a group of German Jagdtigers, hunting tiger tank destroyers. 2 American tanks were knocked out almost instantly. "Pull back, Panthers, pull back," ordered Williams. Rivers radioed his reply. "I see him. We'll fight him." Alongside the tank commanded by Sergeant Walter James, Rivers charged towards the enemy, all guns blazing. "For a few minutes," wrote the military historian Charles W. Sasser, "the American Shermans held their own. Outnumbered and outgunned, they seemed to exist in a charmed atmosphere as brilliant tracers of green bounced off their thick hides. Then a high explosive shell caught Rivers' tank and cracked it like an egg. A second shell finished the job." 11 months after he had joined the Army, ignoring neighbors in Holtica, Oklahoma, who told him that it was a white man's war, Rivers was dead at the age of 26. But the charge which had killed him and wounded his crew had allowed the rest of the company to escape the tank destroyers. Captain Williams immediately recommended Rivers for America's highest military award, the Medal of Honor. But Rivers was overlooked. So were others. In fact, during the Second World War, no African-American soldier received the Medal of Honor. Only in 1993 did the U.S. Army accept that there had been a racial disparity in the way Medal of Honor recipients were selected. Finally, on 13 January 1997, President Bill Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to one surviving veteran and to the families of 6 men who had passed away. Grace Woodfork, one of Rivers' sisters, received the medal on her late brother's behalf. The elderly Captain Williams was with her. By then, Grace was no longer just a soldier's sister. She had grown up to become a community activist and the mother of George Livingston, the first black mayor of Richmond, California. George was 10 when he heard Uncle Reuben had died. "I cried for days," he said in 1995. "There are those living the good life now because of them giving their lives." During the war, the 761st participated in 4 major campaigns through 6 countries, all the while earning several battlefield commendations and honors. From the time they entered combat until the end of the war in Europe, the men of the 761st received 7 Silver Stars, 246 Purple Hearts, and 4 Congressional Medal of Honor. By the end of April 1945, the 761st would be one of the first U.S. battalions to meet up with Soviet forces. On April 26, 1945, the 761st rendezvoused with the Red Army in Steyr, Austria. The convergence of the Russian and U.S. armies split the final remnants of the German army in 2, hastening an end to World War II in Europe. In conclusion, the narratives of black soldiers during World War II stand as both a testament to their unwavering courage on the front lines and a poignant reminder of the persistent struggles they faced on the home front. In the crucible of the bloody war, the valor and sacrifice of black soldiers illuminated the path towards a more inclusive and just future. Their experiences, often marred by discrimination, stand as a testament to resilience, courage, and the unwavering pursuit of freedom. May we honor their legacy by acknowledging the profound impact they had on shaping not only the outcome of the war, but also the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. This brings us to the end of this video segment. Stay put for more on the experiences of African American soldiers during the World War. Kindly share your thoughts in the comment section if you learned a thing or two. Don't forget to also like the video, share with family and friends, and subscribe if you are yet to keep the channel growing. We appreciate your support. Thank you for watching.